Hi, I'm Abdul Saad, clinical psychologist at Vital Mind Psychology here in Sydney, Australia. You can check me out at vitalmind.com.au, where you can find out more about my approach, including the coaching services and sessions I offer to international clients. You can also check me out on Facebook. Just search for Vital Mind Psychology. So today I'm recording the third video in this series of videos on the self-transformation process. First video was outlining what self-transformation is. In last week's video, I discussed what brings on self-transformation. And in this week's video, the plan is I want to discuss what blocks the self-transformation process. So, to recap from last week, we said that suffering is a necessary but not sufficient condition for self-transformation, and that suffering, broadly defined as anything which creates an enduring sense of discomfort in our life, dissatisfaction, a sense of loss, a sense of disorientation, that this is actually the fertile ground for our self-transformation, because it smashes our complacency and forces us to look inward. Otherwise, we would perpetually be repeating old maps and old patterns of how we view ourselves and how we interact with the world based on a particular self-image that we have. But we ended last week's video with a key question, and that was, why is self-transformation not more apparent or not more evident in our lives, given that there is no lack of suffering that we experience both collectively and as individuals? In other words, why is it that suffering doesn't usually lead to self-transformation, but instead it leads to more suffering? And to answer the question, I'm going to outline 3 unhelpful responses to suffering, and I'll also be giving some general remarks or other factors that block self-transformation. But before going into that into more detail about the 3 responses to suffering that block self-transformation, I want to briefly discuss when self-transformation work may not be helpful, or in clinical terms may be contraindicated, and also some general remarks about blocks to self-transformation. So when might self-transformation work may not be helpful? When might it not be helpful? Or when might it not be our highest priority? Well, remember that self-transformation work assumes a baseline level of stability. So it need not mean that our life is perfect and that there's no struggles, but in general we can say if we are in a state of an acute crisis, if our day-to-day lives where we have a basic lack of security, we're living in extreme fear, someone with an acute post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, someone that's experiencing overwhelming anxiety, someone that's in the grips of a severe panic disorder, the substance abuse problems, severe addictive issues, these need to be properly dealt with before self-transformation work can begin to be applied in a consistent manner. And often what we find as coaches and therapists is that as we're guiding people, often the first step is just to get a sense of where the person is at, help them with key issues, key symptoms, help them navigate themselves out of crisis situations. And what I reliably see is that the self-transformation process begins to occur organically once we can help the individual to get out of an acute crisis situation where they feel like they're spinning their wheels or they're in a downward spiral. So that's a key area there, that if you're in an acute state of crisis, if you're dealing with an overwhelming set of symptoms, it's a higher priority that you deal on developing, that you work on developing a baseline of stability before beginning self-transformation work. Because self-transformation does assume, as I said, that baseline level of stability and a baseline level of psychological functioning to allow you to turn inward and have that radical self-honesty with yourself. And this is where people need a guide, need an assistance, coach, therapist, psychotherapist, psychiatrist, licensed clinical social worker, family therapist, someone that has an awareness of these dynamics and that can guide you through this process. The label isn't so important, or what degrees the person has. It's more important that it's a right fit. The person has a basic knowledge, knows what they're talking about in terms of mental health, in terms of transformation, personality, and not so much the discipline that they come from, I find, is less important. So find someone that you can work with. Now, more broad remarks about blocks to self-transformation. So most people will continue to suffer because they continue to cling on to these old, outdated maps they have, or patterns that they're running regarding who they are, and based on that, how they are to interact with the world. And although painful, basically these maps or patterns are at least familiar. And for most of us, instead of realizing that we need an entirely new map, what we do is we try to make the old map continually try to fit the situations we encounter in life over and over again. So an empath's map or pattern may go something like this. If I love and sacrifice enough, love will conquer all, and eventually my needs will be met. A nice guy's map or pattern may be, if I'm agreeable, good-natured, and kind, the world will reward me, and I'll be respected and get what I want, including from women, including in terms of the romantic aspect or the sexual aspect of life. But I guess here's the thing. Not only do these old outdated maps or patterns block self-transformation, but so does our reaction to them. So what I'm saying here is that for most people, the block to self-transformation, broadly defined, is the map or the patterns that they're running. Eventually these maps or patterns break down. And then when they break down, the reaction to the breakdown of that map or pattern creates a further obstacle to self-transformation. So let me sort of flesh that out a little bit more. So when our maps or patterns stop working, we can spiral into rage, depression, fear. And I detailed this in the previous video called The Empath in Trouble, Your Downward Spiral with the Narcissist, which essentially what I was discussing in that video is how does an empath react in an unhealthy, self-destructive way once their map or pattern of their idealized self-image as loving, as giving, and that love will conquer all, once that has broken down, what is that reaction that the empath can engage in, which sets them down a self-destructive path that in this context of this video blocks their transformation. So having exhausted the map or pattern, having it reached its expiration date, having it been proven to be flawed or false or unworkable in reality, most people will return to using it over and over again. So the nice guy, after his blowout, returns to being servile, obsequious, and a doormat, getting all the masochistic punishment that he can handle before he lashes out yet again. So what I'm describing here is the basic pattern of block to self-transformation is that we begin to have our patterns break down, we have unhelpful responses to the breakdown of those patterns, and then over time we return back to the original pattern that created the problem because we don't know any better. We don't have any alternative. So coming to the three unhelpful responses to suffering, which in fact create a large obstacle to self-transformation, what I'm going to do at this point is briefly outline what these three responses are, and for you, the viewer and the listener, to go inward and say, well, can I identify with engaging in these unhelpful responses when I encounter dissatisfaction, hardship, loss, adversity in my life? So what's the first unhelpful response to suffering? Well, number one is that we can refuse to suffer. It is the refusal to suffer. We can anesthetize ourselves from our feelings through drugs, alcohol, sex, food, etc. We can also refuse to suffer by becoming obsessed with our image, with our status, with our persona, with the mask we wear to the world. And typically the refusal to suffer, if we look at it through the dynamic of, in terms of narcissism, overt narcissists, grandiose narcissists typically run this particular response style of a refusal to suffer and a seeming obliviousness to suffering. On a less sort of personality disordered end of the spectrum, people who tend to be more extroverted by nature, perhaps not as inward looking, also tend to run this particular response of, number one, a refusal to suffer. So that's one key block to self-transformation, one response to suffering, which is the refusal to suffer. The second unhelpful response to suffering, which blocks self-transformation, is we can indulge in our suffering. We can drown in our suffering. And for this individual, their suffering takes on a status symbol of sorts, becoming the perpetual victim, the martyr, generating further self-sabotaging and frustrating experiences which ensure a continued sense of wounding, cynicism, and dissatisfaction. And for a covert narcissist, this is the typical response they have for suffering. For people that aren't necessarily narcissistic in a disturbed way, people who are more introverted by nature, perhaps more solitary, can also engage in this response style. But really, it can be across the board, but tends to be people who are more introverted, more sensitive to criticism. This particular response to suffering can really get in the way and block their self-transformation unless they're really made aware of it and are encouraged to radically take personal responsibility for this particular response style and begin to deal with it. And the third unhelpful response to suffering, which blocks self-transformation, is that we can make others suffer. We can become hostile, aggressive, vengeful, feeling a sense of righteous indignation to visit our suffering onto others when we feel it is justified because the way that we thought reality works, the way the world works, has not been borne out for us. Now, some people will habitually respond with one or two ways, some with all three, especially with more disturbed personality styles. They may have all three going on full blast in terms of oscillating between a refusal, an indulgence in suffering, and then making others suffer. Now, these responses to suffering block the development of insight and critical self-awareness because they keep us in this endless loop of engaging with our maps and our patterns, having them break down, and then responding to the breakdown of our maps or patterns or habits of attention in these self-destructive ways, only to return to the original way of being that helped create the suffering in the first place. Now, in the interest of time, I want to outline briefly sort of a list of other blocks to self-transformation in the context of what I've been discussing. So anger is one block. Now, I don't mean feeling anger, because anger actually is not in of itself a bad emotion, but more I mean explosive anger, explosive rage is certainly a block to self-transformation, as is inhibited or suppressed anger. So those two ends of the spectrum, that will block or create a major hurdle to the self-transformation process. And if that's something that is part of what's happening for you, it's something you need to address. Fear is a major block to self-transformation. Adopting an overly conservative approach to life, being extremely risk-averse, extremely intolerant of uncertainty. This is going to keep you stuck in painful, self-defeating patterns. Arrogance, of course, will block self-transformation, from narcissism to the need to win, to look good, to always be correct. For obvious reasons that don't need explaining, that's going to create a roadblock to self-transformation. Having a victim mentality, because with victim mentality, the individual has what's called an external locus of control. Everything that's happening is not my fault. Other people are doing this to me. I'm being victimized. I'm being persecuted. An incredibly disabling mentality once that overtakes a person's psyche. Another block to self-transformation is a hyper-rationality. And I mean an extreme rationalism where people need to impose rational, logical, sort of sequential thinking onto everything. And the reason why this blocks self-transformation is because self-transformation requires us to embrace paradox. It requires us to embrace non-linear thinking. It requires us to think laterally about chaos and uncertainty and the world. And it does require a submission to a higher force in the universe. Now, some people are very phobic about religion these days. They don't like the G word, but that can be God for some people, the unfolding of some natural order that is not fully in our control. But I truly believe, in having done thousands of hours of coaching and therapy with people, that the self-transformation process at some level, not in its entirety, but at some level requires some aspect of submission and surrender to a higher power or a higher intelligence or process that can allow the transformation process to unfold within us in concert with the conscious work and effort we are putting into our self-transformation. So people who are incredibly skeptical, hyper-rational, everything has to conform to some predetermined formula, unfortunately, they create a roadblock for their own self-transformation. And the last one I want to mention is being too busy, which is a big issue for us in modern society, because busyness creates a block to interiority, to going inward. We're all guilty of this, spending so much time on our phones. In sort of modern society, one of the rarest occasions for interiority is when we're driving, perhaps, but even then we've got podcasts and lectures and the radio, and there's a constant stimulation which blocks the self-transformation process. So I hope that was helpful to get you to start to think about potential blocks to self-transformation in your life, because in next week's video I'm going to be discussing why self-transformation is terrifying. And what I'll be touching on in that video, what I plan to touch on, God willing, is what does self-transformation, what does the beginning of it actually look and feel like? And it is a terrifying experience at the beginning. And I'm going to go into some more detail about why that is the case and give you a framework and some conceptual tools to begin to think about that in a more, with some more depth, so that you can begin to catch the telltale signs of a potential opening for self-transformation in your life, rather than repeating a particular pattern and going back and finding yourself at square one. So I look forward to that next week. And thank you for all your support of the channel. We hit 3 million views this week, and we're approaching, I think, about 60,000 subscribers. So the channel continues to do well. Very grateful for that. And again, see you next week. God willing, take care. Bye-bye.